Good evening. It's Tuesday, August 11th. California Senator Kamala Harris is the Democratic Party's vice presidential candidate. After long deliberation, Joe Biden finally announces his choice for running mate today. President Trump immediately savages her as a nasty person and ineffective candidate. Russia announces its so-called Sputnik vaccine is ready to launch. The government of Vladimir Putin approves its use today without the normal testing protocols and peer review. But Putin says one of his daughters has already been inoculated with the vaccine. College football begins to shut down its fall schedule as two of the nation's top 5 conferences cancel their games because of the coronavirus pandemic. Tenant activists in California raised the alarm for what they call a tsunami of evictions if state leaders do not approve new protections in the wake of the pandemic. They're worried that a moratorium on evictions created by the state's Judicial Council could end as soon as this Friday. And President Trump's Postmaster General moves to triple the cost for states to mail out absentee or mail-in ballots to voters, and what Democrats denounce as another attempt to undermine the post office and sabotage voting by mail in the November election. From Pacifica Radio, KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Miracle. Joe Biden today named California Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate, making history by selecting the first black woman to compete on a major party's presidential ticket and acknowledging the vital role African-American voters will play in Biden's bid to defeat President Donald Trump. In choosing Harris, Biden is embracing a former rival from the Democratic primary who is familiar with the unique rigor of a national campaign. The 55-year-old first-term senator is one of the party's most prominent figures. She quickly became a top contender for the number 2 spot after her own White House campaign ended. In a tweet, Biden called Harris a fearless fighter for the little guy and one of the country's finest public servants. He said, "Together with you, we're going to beat Trump." Harris and Biden plan to deliver remarks tomorrow near Biden's home in Wilmington, Delaware. Rachel Silverman reports.
Joe Biden's choice of Kamala Harris caps weeks of speculation. He said he needs someone alongside him who is smart, tough, and ready to lead. Kamala Harris was also a candidate for president until she dropped out of the race in December. A native of Oakland, California, and the child of Jamaican and Indian immigrants, Harris's political career has included many barrier-breaking moments. The only black woman in the U.S. Senate, she was first elected in 2016 after serving as California's Attorney General, and before that, San Francisco District Attorney. Rachel Silverman, San Francisco.
Biden, who spent 8 years as President Barack Obama's vice president, has spent months weighing who would fill that same role in his White House. He pledged in March to select a woman as his vice president, easing frustration among Democrats that the presidential race would center on 2 white men in their 70s. Biden's search was expansive, including Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, a leading progressive, Florida Congresswoman Val Demings, whose impeachment prosecution of Trump won plaudits, California Representative Karen Bass, who leads the Congressional Black Caucus, former Obama National Security Advisor Susan Rice, and Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, whose passionate response to unrest in her city garnered national attention, among others. Rice congratulated Harris on her selection, calling her a tenacious and trailblazing leader. Rice said she would support Biden and Harris with all her energy and commitment. Bass tweeted, Kamala Harris is a great choice for vice president. Her tenacious pursuit of justice and relentless advocacy for the people is what is needed right now. President Trump, dominating the media now with nearly daily news conferences, tried to make it seem that he was hoping Biden would choose Harris because she's such a weak candidate.
She's in favor of socialized medicine, where you're going to lose your doctors, you're going to lose your plans. She wants to take your health care plans away from 180 million Americans. 180 million Americans that are very happy with their health insurance, and she wants to take that away. So she was my number one pick. I mean, she was, as they would say, because hopefully you'll start college football, she was my number one draft pick. And we'll see how she works out. She did very, very poorly in the primaries, as you know. She was expected to do well, and she ended up at right around 2% and spent a lot of money. She had a lot of things happening, and so I was a little surprised that he picked her. I've been watching her for a long time, and I was a little surprised. She was extraordinarily nasty to Kavanaugh, Judge Kavanaugh then, now Justice Kavanaugh. She was nasty to a level that was just a horrible thing, the way she treated now Justice Kavanaugh, and I won't forget that soon. So she did very poorly in the primaries, and now she's chosen, so let's see how that all works out.
Does the marijuana legalization vote for you rather than her because she convicted so many people in the past?
I can't tell you what she's voting for. I don't think she knows what. I think Joe knows even less than she does. But I was a little surprised at the pick. A lot of people would say that might be the pick. I was more surprised than anything else because she did so poorly. Many people did much better than her in the primaries. She did very poorly in the primaries. And that's like a poll.
Harris has bluntly attacked Trump, labeling him a drug pusher for his promotion of the malaria drug hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for the coronavirus, which has not been proved to be an effective treatment and may even be harmful to some patients. After Trump tweeted, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, in response to protests about the death of George Floyd, an African-American man in police custody in Minneapolis, Harris said, his remarks yet again show what racism looks like. The vice presidential pick carries increased significance this year. If elected, Biden would be 78 when he's inaugurated in January, the oldest man to ever assume the presidency. He's spoken of himself as a transitional figure and hasn't fully committed to seeking a second term in 2024. If he declines to do so, his running mate would likely become a front-runner for the nomination that year. The number of confirmed coronavirus cases in the world has passed 20 million. That milestone arrived as Russia became the first country to approve a vaccine against the virus. Russian President Vladimir Putin said at a government meeting that one of his 2 adult daughters had already been inoculated. Putin said the Russian vaccine underwent the necessary tests and offered a lasting immunity from the coronavirus. But scientists warn that rushing to start the new vaccine in use before phase 3 trials, which normally last for 6 months and involve thousands of people, is risky. Julia Chapman reports from Moscow.
Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the registration of the vaccine against coronavirus, which has been called Sputnik 5, named after the first satellite to be launched into space. He says all of the necessary checks have been carried out, and even one of his daughters has been inoculated with the vaccine. But there have been concerns raised by epidemiologists and clinical trials bodies that say that there's simply not enough data to know whether this is actually a safe and effective vaccine that should be used by the wider public. Now, Russian health officials say that that's because they haven't seen the data yet, but that's because none has been published. We don't even know how many people have received this vaccination as part of clinical trials. Nevertheless, Russia is pushing ahead and says this is their Sputnik moment once again. Julia Chapman, Moscow.
Dr. Peter Drobak is at Oxford University, which is also working on developing a vaccine. He told Al Jazeera the Russian approval of the vaccine is premature.
The vaccine has only been tested on, at best, a couple of hundred people. Those data have not even been published. So even those early results, we really only know what's come out in press conferences from politicians, but the scientific community has not been able to review those data. And of course, they haven't yet done those critical phase 3 trials where you really need thousands of patients to demonstrate both safety and effectiveness. So at this stage, I really think this is a risky move.
A new report shows a 90% increase in coronavirus cases among U.S. children in the past 4 weeks. Nearly 180,000 children were reported to have contracted COVID-19 in the 4 weeks ending August 6th. Children make up 9% of recorded cases. That percent has been steadily rising since the beginning of the pandemic. A total of 380,000 child cases of coronavirus have been recorded since the pandemic began. So far, 90 children are reported to have died from the disease. Johns Hopkins University reports a total of more than 163,000 U.S. deaths. The Reuters news service reports that the Trump administration is considering a measure to block U.S. citizens and permanent residents from returning home if they are suspected of being infected with coronavirus. An official told Reuters that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention would issue the regulation, which still hasn't been completely drafted. The director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Immigrants' Rights Project told Reuters that barring U.S. citizens from entering the country would be unconstitutional and another grave error in a year that has already seen far too many. Sarah Walton reports.
Officials are said to be circulating a proposal which would mean U.S. citizens and permanent residents suspected of having the virus would not be allowed back home from Mexico. Medical experts have warned the restrictions would do little to control the pandemic in the US because there's already widespread community transmission. President Trump has previously cited the pandemic as a reason to impose new rules at the border, which means detained migrants are immediately being returned to Mexico. However, it's not clear if the Trump administration has the legal authority to take such action against citizens and residents. I'm Sarah Walton in New York.
Santa Clara County supervisors were set to vote today on whether to fine individuals and businesses who don't abide by coronavirus regulations. Individuals could face penalties ranging from $25 to $500. Businesses could be fined from $250 to $5,000. Supervisors were also to consider voting on extending the county's eviction moratorium through the end of September. San Francisco Mayor London Breed announced that the latest coronavirus infections and deaths in the city.
As of today, we have 7,692 cases, and sadly, 67 people have died from COVID. Until we have a vaccine, until we are in a better place, we know that we need to continue to socially distance ourselves from one another, wear our mask as much as possible, and follow our public health guidelines. We have to start getting comfortable with it. We have to start changing our behavior. It really is what's going to make the difference.
She says the city will likely spend $446 million to address the coronavirus pandemic this year. More confusion over President Trump's so-called executive orders on the coronavirus economic crisis over the weekend. White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow said today the Labor Department expects enhanced unemployment checks to go out in roughly 2 weeks. Kudlow told Fox News' America's Newsroom that the baseline of unemployment from states is roughly $400 per person per week. That's the median, he said. On top of that, the federal government is going to put in $300. He said he'll work with governors if there's any complications. President Trump's executive actions included $400 a week in supplemental unemployment aid, a replacement of the program passed under the CARES Act earlier this year that gave unemployed people $600 a week extra until the federal program expired at the end of July. At first, the action required states to pay for 25% of the $400 weekly benefit, while the federal government would pick up 75%. Today, Kudlow indicated the administration was backing away from that and said the administration would consider any $100 in unemployment insurance a state contribution. But it's still unclear if the president actually has the authority to do this and whether the bureaucratic complications between the states and various federal funds will even allow it to happen. The coronavirus pandemic has placed unprecedented stress on the country's small businesses, and with no end in sight, almost half of small business owners recently surveyed said they anticipate needing additional financial support over the next 6 months. Nadia Ramlagan reports.
The Paycheck Protection Program deadline is now Saturday after Congress extended the deadline to allow more small business owners to participate. Kevin Kuhlman of the National Federation of Independent Business says 4 out of 5 small business owners already have applied for relief, and almost all of them were granted loans.
But 7 in 10 small business owners have already extended all of that funding. So many are in the process of applying for forgiveness. That timeline begins on August 10th. About half are looking for additional financial assistance in the next 12 months.
The survey finds 21% of small business owners have or anticipate having to lay off employees due to the COVID-19 crisis. Arkansas is home to more than 247,000 small businesses, employing nearly 480,000 people, according to data from the Federal Small Business Administration. Kuhlman adds that on the positive side, almost half of small business owners said they are nearly back to where they were in sales, and some have even surpassed pre-COVID profits. But he points out that the uncertain nature of the pandemic means companies' situations could change overnight.
But they still face challenges, whether it's shutdown orders or stay-at-home orders or constraints on some of the financial assistance that has been provided.
He says small businesses are an economic powerhouse for many communities and believes their resistance is vital for long-term economic health.
Small businesses pre-pandemic provided almost half of the jobs. They created 2/3 of all new jobs, and they provide about half of the GDP to the economies.
The HEALS Act, a 4th-round relief package backed by Senate Republicans, would allow small businesses to apply for a second forgivable paycheck protection loan, but only if they can show their revenue has decreased by at least 50% during the pandemic. For Public News Service, I'm Nadia Ramlagan.
You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFC at Fresno, online at kpfa.org. Tenant activists warn of what they call a tsunami of evictions if state leaders do not approve new eviction protections in the wake of the pandemic. They worry that a moratorium on evictions created by the State Judicial Council could end as soon as this Friday, leading to evictions that could force millions out on the streets in the midst of a deadly pandemic. Christopher Martinez reports.
As many as 4 million California renters are at risk of losing their homes if the State Judicial Council votes Friday to end an eviction moratorium. Activists are urging quick action to extend eviction protections by passing Assembly Bill 1436 by San Francisco Democrat David Chu. They call that measure the last bill alive in the legislature that could prevent a tsunami of evictions. Vignesh Kanapati is with the on-demand logistics and delivery company Postmates. He says this moment calls for urgent action.
Many households across the state have been unable to pay their rent and are at risk of losing their homes when the current eviction protections are lifted. The message is to stay home, but how do you stay home when you have none?
Fred Blackwell is CEO of the San Francisco Foundation. He says before COVID-19, California was in the throes of a housing and homelessness crisis, and the pandemic is raising the stakes.
We have always known about the links between, housing security and health. And what COVID-19 has done has made that link even more clear. We have heard one story after another from our partners on the ground that in this moment, the ability to shelter in place, the ability to social distance is directly related to folks' ability to have safe and secure housing. And that if your housing is secure, if you're homeless, your health is in jeopardy.
A federal eviction moratorium that was part of a COVID relief bill expired in late July. California, like 42 other states and the District of Columbia, enacted its own eviction protections, but 24 of those state measures have expired, according to Princeton University's Eviction Lab, and California's moratorium could end in days. The Aspen Institute and the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Program estimate that 29 million renters are at risk of evictions nationwide by the end of the year, if there is no action to protect tenants. Melvin Willis is a city council member from Richmond. He says there was a housing crisis even before the pandemic, and now he says an eviction moratorium is the fiscally and morally responsible thing to do.
Right now in the United States, we're number one in the worst cases per day. And forcing a bunch of people into homelessness is not going to make that any better for any of us. So AB 1436 needs to pass. I'd like to see the governor actually step up more and strengthen a unified statewide eviction moratorium and advocate for the cancellation of rents and mortgages across the board to protect families that were already struggling and are now even further devastated as a result of this pandemic.
The activists say a wave of evictions during a pandemic would be devastating, especially for communities of color that have been hit hardest by COVID-19 and the resulting recession. Reverend Penny Nixon is with the Peninsula Solidarity Cohort. She says she's studied the 1918 influenza pandemic, and she says it's amazing the advances that we've made medically and scientifically.
But what I'm left with is, have we evolved morally? We use all this sophisticated economic language to veil what is at its heart a moral issue. It's a moral choice to allow people to be evicted during this pandemic. And what we keep hearing all the time is we're all in this together. Well, really? Because it sure doesn't feel that way for a lot of people in my congregation, especially the Latinx people in my congregation. They are clinging to a lifeboat that could be punctured if AB 1436 isn't passed.
Reporting for Pacifica Radio News KPFA, I'm Christopher Martinez.
New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern announced that authorities have detected 4 cases of the coronavirus in one household from an unknown source. These are the first reported cases of local transmission in the country in over 100 days. Ardern moved to close down Auckland, the nation's largest city, from tomorrow through Friday.
At level 3, you're asked to stay at home in your bubble, other than for essential movements such as going to the supermarket or local recreation. If you are in Auckland, you must work from home unless you are an essential service worker. All schools and childcare facilities in Auckland are closed as of tomorrow morning, except for the children of essential service workers. And those who are involved will remember that at level 3 we allow you to access schools and early childhood for a level 3 for essential service workers only. All public facilities, bars, restaurants and businesses must close by midday tomorrow.
Ardern said over the next 3 days, officials will assess the situation and undertake widespread contact tracing so they can make decisions about how to respond once they have further information. The Big Ten and Pac-12 conferences will not play football this fall because of concerns about COVID-19. The decisions take 2 of college football's 5 power conferences out of a crumbling season amid the pandemic. The Big Ten's announcement that it was postponing all fall sports and hoping to make them up in the second semester came first. An hour later, the Pac-12 called a news conference to say that all sports in its conference would be paused until January 1st, including basketball. The Atlantic Coast Conference, the Big 12, and the Southeastern Conference are still moving ahead forward, at least right now, with plans to conduct a football season. But as much of the college football cancels its schedule, and the major professional sports in the country, basketball, hockey, and baseball, conduct their truncated seasons in stadiums and arenas without any fans, South Korea believes it's got the coronavirus pandemic enough under control to let baseball fans back into the stadiums to watch its professional baseball league play. Bruce Harrison reports from Seoul.
The Korean Baseball Organization has set the new cap at 25% seating. It's a significant bump from the 10% cap they set in late July when fans were first allowed to return. The regular season opened in May, but the government kept strict social distancing measures in place for months until it felt large gatherings could be held safely. Fans are still banned from eating in the stands and yelling and cheering in order to prevent the virus from spreading through the air. Over the past month, South Korea has seen about several dozen new daily infections on average, with the number at times falling to single digits. I'm Bruce Harrison in Seoul.
5 states are conducting primary elections today: Minnesota, Georgia, Vermont, Connecticut, and Wisconsin. Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is about to learn whether voters in her Minneapolis area congressional district support the mix of confrontational anti-Trump progressivism and celebrity that she brings to the job. Omar, the first Somali American and one of the first 2 Muslim women elected to the Congress, is facing a surprisingly well-funded challenger in Minnesota's Democratic primary. Antone Melton Moe, a black lawyer and mediator, raised millions of anti-Omar dollars to fill mailboxes and flood the airwaves. He's focused on the 5th message, has portrayed Omar, a member of the squad of 4 progressive female lawmakers, as out of touch with the 5th District. Omar rejected Melton Moe's attacks, saying they were funded by interests that wanted to get her out of Congress because she's effective. She also downplayed Melton Moe's money and played up her ground game before the vote, saying organized people will always beat organized money. The outcome may not be known tonight. If the results are close, absentee voting in Minnesota was heavy. Officials must count mail-in ballots that arrive as late as Thursday under safety rules imposed due to the coronavirus pandemic. In Georgia, a Republican criticized for promoting racist videos and adamantly supporting the far-right QAnon conspiracy theory faces a neurosurgeon who campaigned on his experience to improve the healthcare system in today's Republican primary runoff for an open U.S. House seat representing Northwest Georgia. The results could indicate just how far candidates can push the limits of political rhetoric in the age of President Trump before triggering a backlash from voters. Businesswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene and Dr. John Cowan have both positioned themselves as staunch Trump supporters, pushing anti-abortion, pro-gun, and pro-border wall messages. But while Cohen has taken a more traditional campaign approach, Greene has found a loyal following by sharing video chats and social posts expressing openly racist, Islamophobic, and anti-Semitic views. Lily Wolke reports.
In Georgia, 2 Trump allies are in the Republican House runoff for the 14th District. Marjorie Taylor Greene received the most votes in the June primary, but not the 50% required to outright win. After the primary, videos surfaced of Greene making racist, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic comments. She's also embraced QAnon, a fringe conspiracy theory. Navy reservist Nicole Rodden also ran in the June primary. She's now backing neurosurgeon John Cowan over Greene.
She is spouting nonsense that could place President Trump's re-election and both U.S. senators at risk of losing to the Democrats.
From Pacifica Network and Public News Service, I'm Lily Bolke.
A U.S. Postal Service panel has reportedly advanced a proposal that would increase states' postage cost for mail-in ballots from 20 cents to 55 cents per ballot. Currently, states pay the 20-cent marketing mail rate when sending mail-in ballots out to voters. But the new proposal advanced by the executive leadership team would reportedly require them to pay the standard first-class mail rate of 55 cents. Voters already pay the standard first-class mail rate to return their ballots, although 17 states cover that cost for voters. Sources familiar with the proposal say there was no clear rationale for the policy, except to bring in additional revenue for the cash-strapped agency. And states pressed for the lower rates to stay in place during discussions about the proposal. Democrats passed a coronavirus relief bill back in May, which would provide $25 billion to help the Postal Service. The counterproposal from Senate Republicans offered no money for the agency. The Democratic proposal also included $1 trillion for states facing severe revenue shortfalls, which could be further strained by the new Postal Service proposal. President Donald Trump and Senate Republicans have balked at the funding, and negotiations over the overall package in Washington remain stalled. But it's more than just the money. Postmaster General Louis DeJoy is a major Trump donor and has millions of dollars invested in private competitors to the Postal Service. He's already canceled overtime and slowed down mail delivery, and over the weekend fired top post office officials in a weekend massacre. Two House Democrats are demanding DeJoy's removal. They cite his action removing the top post office officials. Oregon Democrat Representative Peter DeFazio accuses DeJoy of doing the president's bidding by sabotaging mail delivery with the November election less than 90 days away. North Carolina Congresswoman Alma Adams said that DeJoy is unconstitutionally sabotaging the Postal Service with a complete disregard for the institution's promise of the safe and speedy transit of the mail and the prompt delivery of its contents. Today, Democratic Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer denounced DeJoy for that reported plan to force the states to pay nearly 3 times more to mail ballots to voters. Trump called it an outrageous and insidious policy that would make it even harder for states that are struggling economically to conduct elections safely during the coronavirus pandemic.
The Postal Service has informed some states they may need to pay a first-class rate to deliver ballots rather than the normal rate, nearly tripling the cost. At a time when people will have to vote by mail in record numbers because they can't or won't go vote in person, the Postmaster General is saying we should triple the rate of cost to vote by mail? What a despicable derogation of democracy.
In a tweet, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders says the proposal is a blatant attempt by Trump's hand-picked Postmaster General to sabotage the Postal Service, suppress the vote, and undermine democracy. Sanders says DeJoy should either resign or be removed from office immediately. Trump is on a campaign to restrict mail-in voting if he's unable to stop it altogether, as well as to discredit the November election in general, calling it the most corrupt ever in U.S. history. What's his game plan? Alan Hirsch, professor at Williams College and author of A Short History of Presidential Crisis and How to Prevent the Next One, gave his worst-case scenario to host Mitch Jeserich on the Letters and Politics show.
It is the ultimate in a self-fulfilling prophecy when he declares that this is going to be the most disastrous election ever. He is doing everything possible to see to it that that's the case by discrediting mail voting, which of course we need at a time when it's unsafe in many states for people to congregate in public and stand close to each other for what in some cases is hours. So he's putting, theoretically, he's putting the efficacy of the effectiveness of the election ahead of public health. But I think not to be too cynical, he's putting his own personal advantage ahead of our democracy, because he's not interested in an election that is free of fraud. He's interested in an election, just as you say, which should he come out on the short end of, he can question the legitimacy of. So, Yeah, I agree with you completely.
What can that lead to, do you think? What is it? What danger is there in questioning the legitimacy of an election?
Well, I guess there's two things. One, there is simply the confidence the people have in their government. And when people don't trust that the winners of an election will take office, when they don't trust that they have the means of controlling who their leadership is, as the Constitution says they do, they're going to, let's say they're going to be frustrated and eventually desperate, eventually take to the streets. But secondly, there's the greater fear, not just loss of trust, but that we actually have a constitutional crisis where it's not clear who the president is, or more to the point, it is clear, but the sitting president refuses to abandon the office. It's incredible that we're even talking about that, but it's come to that. And if it does come to that President-elect Biden can't take the office because President Trump refuses to yield it, then Chairman Mao Zedong, I don't usually quote erstwhile communist dictators, but he was right when he said ultimately all power comes from the barrel of a gun. And were Trump to resist the results of the election and refuse to abdicate office, it would come down to whether the military, whose side they were on. And again, God only knows, this feels like it's a political novel, but it is not out of the question that this is where we will be in several months.
And that's interesting because I suspect that the military would not necessarily back Donald Trump, say, in a coup. But that said, the fact that the question would even be put to the military is astounding.
Yeah, totally. I share your view that when push comes to shove, we've seen some distancing from the Secretary of Treasury, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They were embarrassed, I think, by their role in the gassing of American citizens so Trump could take his photo op walk and hold the Bible. So I suspect the military would not cooperate in a de facto coup. But boy, oh boy, I never thought we would reach the point where we had to hope that was the case to be confident that our democracy would continue as a functioning democracy. So these really are kind of scary times. And the president has done nothing to assuage those fears, quite the opposite.
All right, so there is the avenue of the military, again, which is remarkable to say. And I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm probably doubtful, but it's there. Another avenue is through the courts. Could this have an effect on what happens come November?
So absolutely. So we could be in roughly the same boat we were in 2020. The difference is where we're litigating in state and federal court, and there is chaos and time is a wasting as we reach the dates that we talked about that are set in concrete.
I just want to be clear, you were talking about 2000.
I'm sorry, 2000, exactly. It's Freudian slip that I'm already thinking 2020, it may happen again, which is sort of obviously the point of your question.
That's why we asked you to come on.
Thank you. In 2000, that happened because the election was a de facto tie. And as I talk about in great length in my book, we simply don't have the mechanisms in place for reliably resolving a situation where the ballot box does not declare a clear winner.
Alan Hirsch is a humanities instructor at Williams College and chair of its Justice and Law Studies program and author of the book, A Short History of Presidential Crises and How to Prevent the Next One. You are listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online, kpfa.org. It's an hour-long newscast. It airs each night at 6, and it's available online at kpfa.org. I'm Mark Miracle. Contra Costa County supervisors approved a budget amendment today, including approximately $12 billion to hire 24 new sheriff's department sworn officers. Supervisors say the money taken from CARES Act funding for coronavirus relief would be used to support mental health services inside county jails. However, many members of the public opposed the move, saying that elected officials should defund the Contra Costa County Sheriff and redirect the money towards social services that prevent crime. KPFA's Chris Lee reports.
Nearly all of the 90 or so public commenters who queued up to speak during a Contra Costa County Board of Supervisors meeting spoke against the proposal to direct nearly $12 million in CARES Act dollars to hire 24 new Contra Costa sheriff deputies to work at the Martinez detention facility. Melvin Willis, a Richmond City Council member, says that the county should be using the CARES Act funding to address homelessness and improve health care access.
If you were struggling, if you were broke, if you were not loved, if you didn't have structure and all you had to do is survive, it's easy to end up in the criminal justice pipeline. And that's what communities in Contra Costa County are going through. Lack of resources, lack of support, put into a corner and forced to survive. Take away everything from a person and give them no support, you're setting them up to fail. And funding the sheriff to go after those folks and locking them up because some of them are just trying to survive out there and dealing with a lot of pain and we're not helping them heal is only perpetuating the cycle of mass incarceration.
David Twa, Contra Costa County Administrator, says that additional funding is necessary because many of the mentally ill people who end up in Contra Costa County's jails have nowhere else to go.
Obviously, our goal, I think with everybody's goal, is to not have people in our jail if at all possible, number one, and certainly not have those who are mentally ill in the jail. But it's a question of again, a lot of them who are incompetent to stand trial. The state has the responsibility to take those over, but the state has, in essence, abandoned that. They have not built any facilities. They have not provided the space, and so therefore it becomes our responsibility to deal with it.
Supervisor John Joya contested the need for 24 new hires, siding with many of the public commenters who said mentally ill people should not be in jail in the first place. He also says the county should shut down the Marsh Creek detention facility.
We all know that mental health services are better provided in the community than in jail. We also, at least I believe, that less people should be incarcerated, including less people with mental health challenges. And that's ultimately why we need to reform our justice system. The reality for us at the county is that the system sends people with mental health issues to us and our jails every year. And these aren't individuals that we can turn away.
Joya floated the idea of transferring existing sheriffs from other facilities, but that idea was quickly argued down by other council members, who cited understaffing as the principal reason why the new sheriffs were necessary. Many members of the public said that the funding allocation would set a new precedent, creating new positions that would need to be funded again in the next budget cycle. Joya was the only council member who voted against the $11.7 million additional monies for 24 more Contra Costa sheriff deputies. The amendment was approved 4-1. I'm Chris Lee, reporting for KPFA.
Seattle's police chief says she's stepping down. Carmen Best, who was Seattle's first African-American police chief, announced the move the same day the city council approved a 3% reduction in the Seattle Police Department's budget and a reduction in the salaries of the police chief and 2 other top department leaders. City administrators said Seattle's budget adopted by the council could cut as many as 100 officers through layoffs and attrition. But Seattle City Council member Kashana Sawant blasted the budget cuts as insufficient and said they do not defund the police.
Many activists in the movement will be outraged at council members for reversing their pledges to defund the police by 50%, and they should be. This vote is going to reduce the police budget by less than 2%. That's not a defunding. Less than $3 million out of $170 million remaining in the SPD's budget this year, instead of the 50% demanded by the movement and promised by 6 of the 8 Democratic council members. It represents a total abdication of responsibility. An abdication of responsibility in the context of the historic movement for Black lives, the brutal attacks on protesters, the Seattle police's long record of racist and violent policing, and 8 years of failed attempts at police reform.
Other council members said the changes were a starting point in a long process to reimagine policing and public safety in Seattle. Civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump plans to sue the police and school district in Key West, Florida, over their arrest of a crying 8-year-old boy with disabilities who allegedly punched a teacher. Police video of the 2018 arrest, posted on social media by the lawyer, shows officers lecturing the boy and escorting him out on a felony battery charge.
You're going into jail, so you need to stand up and put your hands behind your back. You understand this is very serious, okay? And I hate that you put me in this position that I have to do this.
The Miami Herald reported that the incident began when the 8-year-old was not sitting properly at his cafeteria bench seat, and a teacher asked him several times to sit down out of concerns for his safety. According to the school resource officer's arrest report, the teacher then told the boy to sit next to her, and he refused. Then she told him to walk with her, and the boy talked back and punched her. The Key West police chief said his officers followed standard procedures and did nothing wrong. The Los Angeles County Sheriff says he has concerns about tactics deputies used to detain 3 teenagers at gunpoint after the mother of one said the youths had been threatened by a man holding a knife. Sheriff Alex Villanueva said in a social media post that he had seen a video of the incident, which was uploaded by one of the teens' mothers to her Instagram profile last week, and that the matter is being investigated. CBS Los Angeles reported that the trio were teenagers. Deputy Juanita Navarro, a spokeswoman for the sheriff's department, said the youths were not arrested during the incident Friday and had been released at the scene. An attorney for the teens, Robert Brown, says 2 of the teens are black, 1 is white. Tammy Collins wrote on Instagram that her son was sitting with friends at a bus stop in the Santa Clarita Valley when a man asked them if they had any drugs and then tried to steal their belongings. She said the man then pulled out a knife and tried to stab them. Collins wrote that bystanders called police to help the boys, although she wrote that apparently one caller reported that the teens were attacking the man. Navarro said a caller reported that 2 black men in their early 20s had struck a man with a skateboard. The 11-minute video Collins posted shows at least 3 deputies pointing their guns at the teens, including one deputy who had a long gun. The teens obeyed the deputy's commands to back up with their hands up and knelt on the ground to be handcuffed. Bystanders shouted at the officers that the teens didn't do anything. The bystanders also tried to advise the teens as they were being detained, saying, "Keep your hands up, keep your hands up," as well as just listen to them and it'll be over soon, and don't answer any questions until your mom gets there. After the teens were handcuffed, the deputies argued with the crowd over what had happened and what the callers had reported. One deputy said, "If they weren't doing wrong, we wouldn't be here." California Supreme Court says Los Angeles County must pay the full $8 million damage award to the family of a black man whose death in 2012 had similarities to the recent police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. L.A. Sheriff's deputies pinned Darren Burley to the ground with their knees. One deputy kneeled on his back, the other on the back of his head near his neck. He died 10 days later. Jurors had found that Burley was 40% responsible for his own death by resisting, so an appeals court later reduced the payout by $3.2 million. But the California Supreme Court reversed that ruling and said the county owes his family the entire $8 million. The attorney who represents Burley's family said the ruling holds that in the state of California, victims of police misconduct are going to be able to avail themselves of every law in the legal toolkit to redress violations of their civil rights. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology,
prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m. right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
A federal appeals court in Washington heard arguments today in the criminal case against the president's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. Flynn is appealing for a dismissal of perjury charges backed by President Trump's Justice Department. But the presiding judge in his case, Emmett Sullivan, has refused to immediately grant the Justice Department's request to drop the prosecution. The court's not deciding whether the case should be dismissed or whether the Justice Department had good reason to move to drop it back in May, despite Flynn's own guilty pleas. Instead, the question before the court is a more procedural one, whether Flynn's attorney is entitled to leapfrog Judge Sullivan and get an order from the appeals court forcing him to dismiss the prosecution before Judge Sullivan himself has had a chance to rule. Judge Sullivan's attorney argues the request is unprecedented and that Judge Sullivan should be allowed to do his job.
The district court is doing what district courts do, preparing to rule on a motion. The judge has not asked any questions of the government or anyone else. No fact-finding has been requested, and briefing by the parties is not finished. Once that process is complete and the judge studies the papers, there may be little left to discuss at the hearing. The parties' speculation and fears about what the district court might do are not a proper basis for mandamus. Indeed, all agree that this court has never granted mandamus before giving a district court an opportunity to rule.
Flynn pled guilty twice to lying to the FBI as part of the special counsel's investigation into the Trump campaign and the Russian interference in the 2016 election. But after William Barr was appointed Attorney General, the Justice Department decided to drop the case. A previous 3-court panel at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, that's a 3-judge panel, ruled 2-1 to order Judge Sullivan to dismiss the case. Today, the full 10-judge circuit court heard arguments. Flynn's attorney argued since the Department of Justice requested the case be dismissed, the judge, Judge Sullivan, was obligated to drop it. Here's Flynn's attorney, Sidney Powell.
Only the Department of Justice can decide the public interest and myriad factors inherent in pursuing a prosecution. This is not an ordinary motion on which there can be factual development or debate. This is a Rule 48A case dispositive motion as to which the executive branch has sole discretion and determinative authority. The government has dropped the case, and every 48A decision in the country requires this motion be granted.
Several of the judges appeared inclined to let Judge Sullivan decide. They made clear through questioning they were skeptical of the argument that Judge Sullivan could not rule on his own. They were also critical of the argument that Sullivan was not entitled to scrutinize the Justice Department's decision and probe the motives behind the government's decision to abandon the Flynn prosecution. Judge Thomas Griffith, an appointee of President George W. Bush, bristled when Flynn's lawyer, Sidney Powell, characterized the role of the judge as pretty ministerial when the government and the defendant both agree that a case should be dismissed.
It's pretty ministerial.
Well, that's not, Ms. Powell, that's not helpful. It's not ministerial. You know it's not. The case law doesn't say it's ministerial.
Well, no, Rinaldi does.
So it's not ministerial, so that means that the judge has to do some thinking about it, right? The judge just is not simply a rubber stamp.
A ruling against Flynn would not undo his guilty plea or end the case, but simply return it to Judge Sullivan for a hearing on the government's request to dismiss. The more than 3 hours of arguments were the latest step in a long-running legal saga that has prompted an extraordinary power struggle between the executive and judicial branches. The case will almost certainly persist for months if the court rejects Flynn's efforts to get a speedy dismissal and returns the case to U.S. District Judge Emmett Sullivan. The shattered city of Beirut, Lebanon, today marked a week since the catastrophic explosion that killed at least 171 people, injured thousands, and plunged the country into a deeper political crisis. Thousands of people marched near the devastated port, remembering those who died in the most destructive single blast to hit the country ever. They observed a minute of silence at 6:08 p.m. local time, the moment on August 4th that thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate exploded in the city's port where it had been stored for more than 6 years, apparently with the knowledge of top political and security officials. At that moment today, church bells tolled and mosque loudspeakers recited a call to prayer. Hundreds marched through the streets of the hard-hit neighborhood of Gamez, carrying portraits of the dead, before candlelight vigil after dusk near the port. Simon Marks has more.
The cabinet resigned on Monday, a direct consequence of public fury sparked by the devastating explosion that destroyed large parts of the city 1 week ago. The cause, thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate unsafely stored in a building in the city's port. Lebanon's Prime Minister Hassan Diab has been asked to stay on in a caretaker role until the country's parliament picks his successor. But that won't satisfy protesters who are expressing fury over corruption that lies at the heart of Lebanon's political system. Jonathan Broder writes about the Middle East for Newsweek.
People are assigned leadership positions not so much according to merit or qualifications as by the sect that they belong to. The Constitution of Lebanon divides power by sect. The people who are chosen for positions of leadership, either in parliament or in the government itself, use the money that comes in, either from foreign donors or from taxes, to keep their particular sect happy. So there's a lot of patronage and cronyism. And this has been going on for decades.
Will things change now? Many protesters are unconvinced, calling for the entire political class, not just the government, to go, and insisting they'll stay on the streets until that happens. With FSN Spotlight, I'm Simon Marks.
The top opposition candidate in Belarus's presidential vote, who initially refused to concede defeat amid a massive police crackdown on anti-government protests, says she's left the country for Lithuania. In a video statement, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya urged her supporters to respect the law and avoid clashes with the police. Her campaign aide said she made the unexpected moves under duress. Holly Barrett reports.
Belarus's opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is safe in Lithuania, according to the country's foreign minister. She's fled Belarus after Sunday's disputed election. Official results said 80% of the vote went to President Alexander Lukashenko. Protests continued in the capital Minsk and other cities for a second day following the poll, which the US, UK and EU have condemned. Journalist Hanna Lyubokova is in the capital Minsk. She says demonstrations taking place in small towns is a new phenomenon in the country.
I think it's actually changing, and that's what we saw in the past weeks and months, that regional, provincial towns protest as well. They gather in thousands, and people just come out to the streets. Even in some towns, small towns, where protests never happened before. So we can assume that Lukashenko has lost support even in those provincial towns.
From Feature Story News in London, I'm Ollie Barrett.
Morning clouds and afternoon sun around the San Francisco Bay Area tomorrow with highs in the mid to upper 60s. Further inland should be sunny all day with highs in the low 90s. In the central San Joaquin Valley tomorrow, sunny and hot with a high predicted of 103 degrees. And mostly sunny in Los Angeles tomorrow with a high in the mid 80s. That's it for the news tonight. For this Tuesday, August 11th. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mark Miracle. Good evening.
This is a community announcement for August 2020.
Help is always available on San Francisco Suicide Prevention's Crisis Hotline at 415-781-0500. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. For more information, visit sfsuicide.org or suicidepreventionlifeline.org. This COVID Coping Community Calendar is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your listing for consideration to KPFA at 1929 Martin Luther King Jr. Way, Berkeley 94704, or email calendar@kpfa.org. To hear this calendar again, call 510-848-6767 extension 621, or view it online at kpfa.org.